In the damp orchards of New England, a quiet war unfolded each spring. The enemy was the codling moth, whose larvae burrowed into young apples, leaving them worm-ridden and worthless. Desperate farmers searched for a weapon, and they found one in a brilliant emerald green powder. This was Paris green, a pigment artists used for its vibrant colour, but it held a secret ingredient: arsenic. Workers would fill cloth sacks with the fine powder, then walk the neat rows of trees. With each swing, they released a cloud of green dust that settled on every leaf, every blossom, every tiny forming fruit. The arsenic did its grim work, poisoning the caterpillars that tried to feed. The apples that grew were smooth, unblemished and perfect to the eye, a farmer's dream finally realized. But the green dust did not stay put. It washed from the leaves with every rain, trickling down the bark to pool at the base of the trees. It seeped into the soil, where earthworms absorbed it. It clung to the skin of the ripening fruit, a microscopic metallic film. No one yet asked what happened to the arsenic after it killed the moth. For now the harvest was saved, and the orchards wore a deceptive, verdant coat. The vivid green powder that had begun in New England now drifted westward. By the 1880s, across the vast orchards of the American Midwest, farmers adopted not just Paris green, but a new, even more potent mixture called lead arsenate. Workers would haul 50-pound sacks to the edge of fields, their fingers brushing against the fine, toxic dust as they tore them open. They dumped the powders into open wooden barrels, stirring the concoction with long paddles until the water clouded into an opaque emerald slurry. The mixture clung to their tools and splashed onto their boots. Then, with hand-pumped sprayers, they drenched the apple trees, coating every leaf and budding fruit in a shimmering, poisonous film. The spray dried into a pale, powdery residue. It dusted the grass beneath the trees and settled into the soil. For the insects, it was a death sentence. For the orchard, it meant perfect, unblemished apples. But with each new growing season, the cycle repeated, layering more arsenic and lead into the very earth that sustained the trees. The toxic mist that settled over the orchards did not spare the men who created it. Each morning, workers hauled sacks of the vivid green powder to the tree lines. They poured the arsenic-laden dust into handheld dusters or early spray tanks, their fingers and cuffs quickly staining a permanent, sickly green. With no masks or gloves, they breathed the fine particles that hung in the still dawn air, a shimmering, poisonous haze. The poison entered through their skin and lungs. On their forearms and necks, where sweat mixed with the residue, angry weeping sores began to bloom. A persistent, metallic taste coated their tongues, followed by waves of nausea that cramped their stomachs. They returned home exhausted, their clothes carrying the green pigment into their households, where it dusted kitchen tables and clung to children's hands. For many, the stomach pain became a constant, dull companion. Doctors of the era recorded cases of chronic gastritis and skin lesions, but the connection to the orchard work was often missed or dismissed. The men endured, believing the sickness was just part of the job. Unknowingly, they were accumulating arsenic in their own bodies, dose by daily dose, as they made the apples look perfect. The green-stained hands of the orchard workers were just one part of the story. In Boston, by the 1910s, public health officials grew suspicious of the polished, perfect apples arriving in city markets. They set up simple laboratories in municipal buildings, their benches cluttered with glass beakers and reagent bottles. Their task was straightforward: to see if the poison applied in the orchard had made the journey to the dinner table. An inspector would select a shiny red apple, its skin waxy under the laboratory lights. He would swab its surface with a cotton pad soaked in a clear chemical solution. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a bright canary yellow stain bloomed across the white cotton. The colour was unmistakable, a positive test for arsenic. The same reagent applied to an unsprayed apple remained a sterile white. Test after test yielded the same vivid result. The chemical reaction proved that arsenic residues clung stubbornly to the fruit's skin, surviving the journey from tree to crate to market stall. No amount of polishing could remove it. The public health reports that followed were blunt. The beautiful apples carried a hidden toxic coating, a direct chemical signature of the green powder used miles away in sun-drenched orchards. The bright yellow stains on market apples had confirmed the public's worst fears. In response, the US Department of Agriculture, in the 1920s, drew a line in the sand. They established the nation's first official tolerance limits, declaring how much arsenic residue could legally remain on fruit. It was a paper shield against an entrenched practice, a number born from alarm but lacking real teeth. Armed with this new rule, inspectors fanned out into the orchards. Their kits were portable chemical laboratories, small wooden cases containing vials of reagents. At a random tree, an agent would wipe a cloth across a glossy apple, then drip a testing solution onto the fabric. A colour change meant a violation, but the vast, rolling acres of sprayed trees stretched far beyond the reach of their occasional visits. For the orchard owners, the calculus was simple. The codling moth guaranteed ruin. A fine for arsenic residue was merely a possible cost of business. So the spraying continued, season after season. The green mist still settled over the blossoms, the enforcement was sporadic, and the poison kept accumulating, not just on the fruit, but deep into the very soil of America's apple country. The tolerance limits set in the 20s did nothing for the land itself. As the post-war building boom accelerated, developers bought up old orchards, bulldozed the gnarled trees, and laid out neat suburban streets where apple blossoms once fell. The new homeowners planted lawns and gardens, unaware that the very soil their children played in was steeped in poison. For half a century, arsenic had rained down from those sprayers, and every drop that missed a leaf had settled into the earth. On a warm afternoon, a child building a fort in a backyard dug his fingers into the cool, dark dirt. He moulded mud pies, the grainy soil caking under his nails and clinging to his skin. With every handful, he was handling a concentrated residue of Paris green and lead arsenate. The arsenic, inert and locked in the soil for decades, was now a fine dust on his palms, ready to be inhaled or accidentally ingested. Doctors began seeing puzzling cases in these new neighborhoods. Children with recurring stomach cramps, headaches, and fatigue that defied easy diagnosis. The symptoms were vague, a slow, chronic poisoning that mirrored the orchard workers' ailments from generations before. The source wasn't a shiny apple, but the ground beneath their swing sets. The legacy of the perfect fruit had finally seeped up through innocent play to touch a new generation. Decades after the last sprayer fell silent, the poison hadn't vanished. It had simply sunk deeper. In the 1970s, environmental scientists arrived at those old, overgrown fields where children once played. They didn't look at the trees, which were long gone. Instead, they drove hollow metal tubes into the earth, extracting slender columns of history, soil core samples that told a silent chemical story. Back in the lab, the cores revealed their secrets in vivid color. Chemists added reagents to soil from different depths, watching for the telltale reactions that signaled arsenic. The tests showed how the toxin had migrated down through the decades, but also how it had stubbornly clung to certain clay and organic particles. It wasn't a uniform blanket of poison. It was a patchwork of intense hotspots, concentrated where sprayers had repeatedly turned or where drainage pooled. Plotting these results on maps, the scientists created a chilling new geography. The contamination maps didn't follow property lines or roads. They traced the ghostly outlines of forgotten orchard rows. They proved that arsenic, once applied as a solution, had undergone a chemical marriage with the soil itself. This bond was so strong that the poison resisted washing away, persisting in a toxic reservoir just beneath the grass, waiting long after the industry that deposited it had moved on. The soil maps and core samples from the 70s finally forced action. By the 1990s, state environmental agencies in Washington and New England began the grim accounting. They dispatched teams to walk former farmland, cataloguing thousands of acres now classified as legacy orchard land. Each parcel represented a hidden ledger of arsenic, its total calculated not in dollars but in parts per million lingering in the earth. The response was starkly visual. On fence posts and at the edges of new housing developments, bright yellow signs appeared. They warned residents in blunt language about arsenic in soil, advising against gardening or letting children play in the dirt. For many communities, it was the first official confirmation that the perfect orchards of their grandparents' era had left a permanent stain. The recommended fix was a temporary shield. The agencies prescribed covering the poisoned ground with a thick cap of clean soil, 6 inches, sometimes 12. Bulldozers would grade the land, burying the toxic legacy under imported fill. It was a containment strategy, not a cure, acknowledging that the arsenic bonded to the soil particles below would remain, waiting for generations more. The warning signs posted in the 1990s were only the first step. By the early 2000s, the true scale of the problem demanded action. In neighborhoods built over old orchards, the first backhoes arrived. Their buckets bit into the earth of suburban backyards, lifting soil that had nourished apple trees a century before, now laced with invisible poison. Workers sealed inside white hazmat suits moved through the excavation sites like astronauts on a toxic planet. They directed the operation, their breath fogging the face shields as load after load of contaminated earth was hauled away. The air hummed with the growl of diesel engines, a stark contrast to the quiet residential streets just beyond the orange safety fencing. The final journey for that poisoned soil was a sealed, engineered landfill. Dump trucks deposited thousands of tons of earth into massive, specially lined cells, where it would be capped and monitored. The remediation crews left behind deep, raw pits, soon to be filled with clean soil, a physical attempt to bury a century of agricultural history. The remediation crews packed away their hazmat suits, but the work was far from over. Across the country, modern apple growers now walked those same lands with a different toolkit. They released beneficial insects that hunted pests, planted trap crops to lure moths away, and monitored orchards with pheromone traps, strategies that formed a new doctrine called integrated pest management. When chemical intervention became necessary, they reached not for the old green powders, but for targeted, short-lived pesticides. These modern compounds broke down in sunlight within days, leaving no lasting residue on the fruit. Spray operators wore protective gear, and application was timed precisely to minimize drift, a stark contrast to the blanket arsenic coatings of the past. Meanwhile, in state environmental offices and university labs, soil scientists continued their quiet vigil. They returned annually to designated monitoring wells at legacy orchard sites, lowering sensors into the groundwater. Their data logs showed that the green powder's legacy, though buried, still persisted, a layer of arsenic-contaminated earth lying just inches below the surface, a dormant echo in the soil.